Hello everyone, good afternoon. Are we awake? Good afternoon. Hello. Don't make me make you stand up and jump around like some people at conferences do. So as Bob says, I'm John. I'm one of the co-founders of the Scale Factory. We're a DevOps and cloud infrastructure consultancy working here in London. We're also sponsoring the event, and we have a booth downstairs if you want to go and pick up some swag. I'd just like to take a brief pause because I know the format of DevOpsDays means that it's quite to properly thank the organisers once you get to the end of the day, because the sort of open spaces tend to sort of tail off. So let's give a big round of applause to the people who've organised this and put it on for us. I know it's pretty hard work running events. We do the same thing at times, and the effort needs to go rewarded with applause, if not accolades and money. So I'd like to talk to you today about how boring is powerful. Today, the modern world is quite a sort of noisy place. We tend to have a lot of things vying for our attention all the time. You've got apps and brands and sort of emails popping up, people trying to talk to you and all that kind of stuff. In fact, some of you are looking at your phones now, looking for that dopamine hit of what's going on in Slack or what's happening in Candy Crush or Minecraft or whatever. And this level of attention seeking that comes from our devices is of our own making. We are wired, I think, as humans to seek out excitement and to look for those dopamine hits instead of sitting quietly and thinking to ourselves or reading a book or something of that nature. I don't want to be too old man yells at cloud about this, because I'm the same, and I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it. In fact, Bertrand Russell, in a piece that he wrote in 1930, identified more or less exactly the same thing. I don't think he was quite such a WhatsApp user, but he talked about how we've come to know, or rather to believe, that boredom is not part of the natural lot of man, but can be avoided by sufficiently vigorous pursuit of excitement. And he goes on in this particular piece to talk about how we find ourselves seeking more and more exciting things to get the same kind of emotional response to it, and how that's maybe not necessarily healthy. He goes on to advocate for monotony, which is perhaps not the best thing to be seeking. But I think he probably had a point. Don't worry, it's not all going to be highbrow and philosophy. There are some cartoon slides later. But I think this attitude to the pursuit of excitement is prevalent in our working lives as well. It's not just what goes on in our off hours. There's always something new to go and look at, something new to play with. The press is constantly on you to be looking at machine learning and blockchain and putting a blockchain in your container and all that kind of stuff. And there's always a new hype train to board. And I think probably, considering our industry, this isn't really a surprise. I think a lot of us got into the industry as hobbyists, right? And this is certainly my path. These chaps here, the guy in the middle there is Professor Steve Ferber. They're building the BBC Micro in this photo, or possibly later on the ARM processor. I had the privilege of being lectured by Steve at Manchester University, but my experience of technology was one of sort of going from hobbyist in the bedroom through to university, through to the working world. And to an extent, the fact that I was able to do this is a privilege. I came from a family who were able to afford to buy computers, and so I could spend time entirely on my own, locked away in my bedroom, writing BASIC for a lot of my childhood. I've turned out okay. I don't think it was a massive problem. I think my parents were worried a little while, but they're fairly pleased with this now. They'll see this video and like. I think technology for us hobbyists is interesting precisely because it moves this quickly, right? It's interesting because new things are happening all the time. But I want to come back to the message and say, actually, although excitement is a good thing subjectively, things that are boring are also quite powerful, particularly from an operational perspective. If you're on call, for example, you'd quite like your life to be quite boring if you're on call, right? An exciting on-call shift is not the type of thing anybody really wants, whether it's a sort of regular over-the-weekend thing or on Christmas or New Year's Day, as we've had to contend with at times. We want that to be a boring thing. We want our pager to be quiet. And it's also fair to say that the fact that we now live in a world where a lot of what we do relies on automation tools, like that's probably a direct reaction to being bored at the idea of manually configuring hundreds and hundreds of nodes. So we can channel that sort of boringness and make it positive. There's a huge number of choices of things. Like if you were wanting to start a new project today, you could go and choose any one of these language environments. I probably have missed a few others. It doesn't matter what sort of vertical problem you're trying to solve. There are a number of solutions all vying for your attention to them. Some of them are more modern than others. Some have different properties. But you have to make that kind of choice. And there's so much of it that if we're not careful, if we don't think about our choices well, we might end up following what is basically fashion. Like what is the most fashionable one of these things to do right now? And you've got to be careful with fashion. Not everything that's fashionable or popular is necessarily good. Anyone who had a shell suit or a global hypercolor T-shirt back in the late 80s and early 90s will attest to that. You know, just because something's popular doesn't mean it's necessarily good. Which brings me, of course, to MongoDB. Yeah, I thought that'd be popular. I'm not going to hate on MongoDB. Like my objective today is not to scorn it as a piece of software, but I want to make a few points about the life cycle of how software is developed and how that should play into your choices when you're choosing components. So Mongo rose to popularity after its first release in 2009. And that's kind of an interesting timeline for me because we founded the Scale Factory in 2009 as well. So over the years, we've worked with a number of organizations who've chosen MongoDB as part of their stack. Not always for reasons of fashion, but mostly, I would argue. And over those years, you can see that the popularity of it has increased. We're using GitHub stars here as a sort of measure for popularity. I couldn't find any official stats on usage, but this seems as good a proxy as any. And if you look at how Mongo evolved over time, I went through the release notes on the website, kind of looking for notable milestones in terms of dates and notable milestones in terms of support as well. So this is possibly missing some stuff. If you're familiar with Mongo and are hoping to troll me about how little I know about it, that's fine. I definitely don't know that much about Mongo. Since it's obviously evolved. You know, version 1.2 released in December, but it's worth noting that it took 2 years and a few minor releases before Mongo gained data journaling, which is a feature for write safety, and from then also another major release before you could authenticate yourself against Mongo and sort of prove to yourself that you were who you said you were. Again, a couple of years for role-based access control or for transport level security. And again, another year before we got audit logging, and that, in fact, is only available in the commercial version of the product. So my point is that software doesn't spring fully formed and feature-rich into existence. Software is an evolution, and we know this, right? Because we work with software. Some of us write software. We know that version 1 is never going to work perfectly or have all the features that you're looking for. Perhaps most damningly, actually, the version that was released in November last year was the first release of MongoDB that passed a test suite for cluster data safety, based on the work of Carl Kingsbury, who is famous on Twitter for two things, and this is one of them. I'm going to leave you to find out what the other one is. Some of you know Afa. Basically, until 7 years after the initial launch of that piece of software, MongoDB could lose updates, give you dirty reads or stale reads, and it's only been recently that is properly solved. As I say, I'm not hating on MongoDB. I don't know anything about their decision-making process. I don't know how they got there or how they prioritized those pieces of work. But these are, demonstrable facts of how MongoDB evolved over time. Speaking of business context or decision-making context, these are some things that that we, as a consultancy, urge our customers to consider when they're making decisions about what things to put in their infrastructure, what decisions to make, what to trade off against each other. We tend to ask people to rank these in order of relative importance. And these will change depending on business sector, whether a business is regulated, who their customers are. And they're all worth thinking about. And actually, when we go and visit customers to talk about this stuff, often that's the first time they've properly considered this in that context. We shouldn't be making our software choices in a vacuum. We should be basing our decision making on these sorts of considerations. So if we go back to the sort of the popularity graph for Mongo and overlay some of the sort of notable features on here. If you were a company in 2012, for example, working in the pharmaceutical industry, and you were considering using MongoDB for your data store there, that wouldn't have been a good choice because you would have needed the TLS and the audit logs that provides. And so nowadays, probably a reasonable choice. Back then, probably not. You're in any kind of industry where actually losing data at all is absolutely fatal. Well, MongoDB prior to November last year, not a good plan necessarily. So fashionableness decreases over time, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, John, fashionableness is not a word. Well, fuck you. I looked it up in a dictionary. It actually is. I don't like it either. I kind of typed that and thought, nah, that can't be right. Yeah, apparently that's a real word. As fashionableness decreases, other things increase. So feature availability. As we said, software doesn't spring fully featured into life at its first revision. As people use it and find that it's missing things, they will either add them or ask for them, depending on the open sourceness of the project and the contributory nature of the individual. Quality increases over time. The more deployed something is in production, the more likely it is to improve in quality as people bump up against its sharp edges and figure out how to sand them down. And also reliability increases over time. Security increases over time. So all of this stuff increases over time. Collective knowledge increases over time. The things that, sitting in this room today, there's probably a reasonable amount of knowledge about MongoDB, say, accrued through years of shouting at it. But also not just within a sort of a community like this, but if you look at something like Stack Overflow or GitHub issues, over time, knowledge increases and is searchable and becomes available in those online tools, which allow us to better go to them for troubleshooting rather than having to bust out a debugger. I think it's probably fair to say it's much easier to ask a question on Stack Overflow than it is to bust out GDB and start poking through stack traces. And in fact, I wonder how many people who think of themselves as full stack engineers actually know anything about symbol tables or stack traces. So software becomes boring over time, is my point. Because as it becomes more reliable, it becomes more predictable, it stops being exciting. But that's okay. By boring, I mean it works properly. That's what I mean by powerful. If you've come to DevOps from the sort of from the dev end of things, and actually, show of hands, how many people would consider themselves to have become a DevOps engineer from dev backgrounds? And from ops backgrounds? Okay, so mostly ops people, but also some dev folk as well. You're probably used to this end of the slide over here. This is a graph of how different parts of the IT industry view each other. And as you can see, most people think of sysadmins as the people who are doing this. And you may have come up against that as a pre-DevOps, as a developer, you might have been told, no, you can't install that. No, we're not doing that for you. And the sysadmin attitude is traditionally recognized as these sorts of people. Any Rick and Morty fans in the room? The developers, like, it's the same number of people. We all know from Rick and Morty that actually that gesture means peace among worlds, which is, of course, an entirely appropriate greeting for a movement bringing Dev and Ops together, right? So if you've been told no by operations people before when you've been selecting your software, what I want to do is give you some context for why that might be, and for you to take that context away and consider it when you're next choosing things to add to your stack. This is a pattern I like to call Hacker News driven development. where things get installed and used in the production stack immediately as they become the first link on Hacker News. You laugh, but you've all seen it, and some of you have done it. This pattern's a bit naive. It's a bit unfair, but it's a bit naive. It's a caricature. Hacker News itself is a terrible cesspool of misogyny, and I advise you to never read below the line on it, but it's still a reasonable place to get tech news. There's a lot of fashion-driven stuff going on in Hacker News, right? It's news, it's fashion, it's exciting. You get lots of people talking about the latest and greatest things that they're trying. At best, Hacker News-driven development considers these things, right? You're kind of, how do I get the thing installed on my machine? At best, how do I also deploy it into the production infrastructure, like you might be looking at? We're thinking about language support, how it plays in the development environment, and if you're lucky, we're thinking about test harnesses as well. You can see there's an enormous bunch of space in the middle there that I've left. The operational considerations for adding something to your stack are possibly much, much wider, and they look a bit like this. And the importance of these will vary depending on the business context we were talking about before. In a more regulated industry, such as pharma or fintech or something of that nature, then things like security, logging, audits, that sort of thing are going to be more important. But you need to think about all of these things, and without doing so, you're likely to put things into production that were perhaps ill-conceived and make life a little too exciting for your on-call engineers. Some of these features, in fact, only become available when software is boring. You know, nobody sits down to write a new piece of software, start the editor, right, let's start with auditing or something. Like, that's definitely an afterthought. As a person writing software for a hobby, you're really not that interested in anything other than the direct user experience, and which is why I think some of this stuff ends up being considered later in the life cycle of these tools. You might also consider that the difference in size between the last two slides looks a certain amount like this. You'll almost certainly have seen this on Twitter. This is Michael Ducey's considerations of containers in development versus containers in prod. It's the same story, right? I'm definitely not going to hate on containers today, but the sort of the hype cycle is definitely all Kubernetes right now, and I would argue that some of the things on that previous slide are not fully fleshed out, well thought through solutions to those questions. So please bear in mind the operational considerations when you're choosing your tools, because really the other angle for consideration is what the users want, and the users don't give a toss about any of this. The users of your website really don't care what it's implemented in. They just want to buy their stuff and they just want to get out, and it doesn't matter whether your stack is some kind of early thousands LAMP stack, of which probably 80% of the internet is still made up, or if it's some big, complicated Kubernetes, Envoy, Elixir, OrientDB thing. From a user perspective, they don't care. When was the last time you cared about the stack that a website you were using was built out of? Nobody gives a shit. So when you're thinking about adding things to your stack, the first thing to consider is that maybe you could add the features that you want without adding new components. Like you may already have something in your infrastructure that will let you do the thing that you want to do, without also having to add something new and exciting to the story. What you ought to do when you're making those choices is to spend your innovation tokens, and I've forgotten the name of the chap who spoke at Etsy about this, Dan someone or other. If you Google innovation tokens, is it? He says that you have a certain number of innovation. Dan McKinley, no, thank you very much. The innovation tokens are things that nominally you spend whenever you want to do something interesting. And so what you ought to be doing is choosing innovation tokens, choosing to spend your innovation tokens on things that are beneficial to you as a differentiator for your business. So if you're doing things in a landscape where you are sprinkling machine learning over some well-known problem, then the differentiator for you is probably the machine learning part. And if that's the case, why not use your innovation tokens to buy machine learning tooling and to take on the risk of those being a bit too shiny and a bit too new and a bit difficult to operate, because that's the thing that's going to give you the edge on your competitor. So stick to boring is my conclusion. I think fashionable software carries risk. I think you need to quantify that risk in terms of your business context and consider whether or not you spending a certain amount of engineering time and money or on-call hours dealing with problems in a piece of software that isn't giving you a business edge is the thing that you want to do. And only take those risks if you are differentiating yourself from the competition in some manner. That's me. Thank you very much.